Back on the table. Okay, now it's on.
There.
Okay.
Yeah.
Grab some coffee.
Yeah, take your time.
Little microphone button. So now it's on. Can you
Okay.
hear that echo?
Yes.
So now it's on.
We ready? Good morning. I'd like to call this study session of the Campbell City Council to order on Tuesday, April 25th at 9:02 a.m. And welcome everybody to this morning meeting. And may we have roll call vote, roll call, please.
Councilmember Lopez.
Here.
Councilmember Scazola, absent. Councilmember Furtado.
Here.
Vice Mayor. Here. Mayor Bybee.
Present. And I'll make a note that Councilmember Scazola is remote and not logged in yet, but hopefully he will be able to join. So we'll wait to hear from him. And with that, we are here to discuss a new business item, number 1, the fiscal year 2023-24 budget study session, preliminary work plans, operating budget, and capital improvement plan. And I'll turn the program over to, or the meeting over to our city manager, Brian Leventhal.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council.
Oh, you're due. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. I appreciate the opportunity to represent our budget study session today to you with our executive team and our staff that's here today. As you know, this is our budget process is an iterative process in which we first sit down with the city council and understand the priorities of the council in a very broad sense. And we did that on February 16th. And we came back to you March 21st at the regular meeting and reiterated what we thought we heard from you. And council gave us some additional input and adopted those priorities that is in the staff report as attachment A today. And as part of that process, we then take those priorities and our senior leadership develops work plans for their departments and their program areas that furthers those priorities of the council as we understood them. And we have color-coded those work plans today for you to correlate with those priorities to help understand how they're related. And then we also take those work plans and develop a budget for them. And so when we talk about priorities, those priorities take resources. And we either have existing capacity of our staff to take on those resources, or we look to contract or purchase equipment. And there may be a one-time cost associated with those resources. There may be ongoing costs associated with those resources, and there may be personnel costs associated with providing those resources. And so as part of this development process, the executive team developed not only those work plans, but helped flush out what it would take to accomplish those for the most part. And there's a few exceptions that we will go through today. But what we wanted to really talk to you about today is get your feedback on the 3 areas that are highlighted here on the screen here, those work plans, the preliminary operating budget, and the preliminary CIP budget. And then as part of that, we will also be talking about usage of our ARPA funds. I know we've talked with the council many times about that. That will tie into the discussion today and will be explained in a little bit more detail. So the idea for today is that we are going to have staff present in each of those 3 areas under the work plans, the operating budget, and the CIP. And after each area, with the discretion of the council, the plan is that we would take council questions. So we'll present work plans, take council questions, present the operating budget. We'll take questions, and then present the CIP and take questions. At the end of that process, once the council's questions have been responded to, we would suggest you take public comment on everything that's been said at that moment, up to that moment. And then we would go back through an exercise and revisit each of these 3 areas to take council feedback, in which we will then take. We will crunch the numbers. We don't expect today to be math Olympics for you, but we'll take the high level direction we're going to get today and then develop a budget proposal that will come to you on May 16th. And then finally, based on input on that May 16th budget, there may be some revisions, and we'll bring back the final proposed budget June 20th for consideration and adoption. So that is sort of the plan for today and the plan looking forward. If we can go to the next slide, please. I want to lead into first here are your priorities, and it shows you the color coding of them. Long-term land use planning and housing is blue, Measure O, orange, financial stability, gold, sustainability, green, so on and so forth, community health, purple, and operational is white. And I was going to have our executive team kind of lead you through a discussion in each of these priority areas. We weren't intending to cover every single work plan that's proposed, but we want to provide some structure for you today, because what we do know is that we can't do everything that we want to do with the existing capacity and the existing resources that we have. And when we talked with the council at the priority setting, it was very clear message from the council and direction to staff to listen, to absorb these priorities that the council has interest in, and then to do all those things that I mentioned: develop work plans, understand the ongoing cost, one-time cost, personnel costs, and capacity to get the work done. And to be honest and forthright with the council, if we can't get it all done, what's got to give, and what will stay and what will give. And today is really intended to be that discussion. And we structured it, like I said, into the different priorities. And I didn't want to go through each and every work plan under those priorities, but rather stress those that were either higher priority or lesser priority, and get your feedback on that. So there's some reference point instead of just throwing spaghetti on the wall and seeing what sticks. Want to try to provide you some structure for that discussion. Certainly we'll take input from the council if it's not something we've covered that's in there, or simply something that wasn't in the report or proposed at all. We'd be glad to take input on. But the idea of the presentation is really to focus on the bigger picture items, or those items that perhaps don't need to be funded, for instance, if they don't get grant funds. You'll see in here there is lots of sheets and sheets and sheets of attachments, and it's really easy to get lost in the minutia of those. Our intent today is to kind of bring you up out of that into a higher level discussion about hierarchy and prioritizing the priorities in the work plans. And that's really the basis for today's budget presentation, and the budget presentation as a whole is trying to do what is called a priority-based budget, where we truly are linking all of those things I mentioned, from work plans to one-time costs, to ongoing cost, to personnel costs, to the actual priorities of the council and the community, in a method that's easy to articulate. We've given you lots of charts in here that articulate dollar values to each of the priority areas. But that is just really intended to be a broad brush stroke to really demonstrate how this strategy for developing a budget is done. And I suppose we could all argue and debate whether a work plan or a one-time cost could be under financial stability or community health and safety. And that wasn't the point today to get into that level. It was really just to demonstrate a higher level thought process and a methodology to how we prioritize the expenditure of limited resources. And you will be presented this budget today, and I'm not going to get into the details at this point, but as we present that, you'll get a sense that we really can't afford everything that we want to do, and we're going to have to somehow develop some hierarchy to that. And staff is going to present to you our recommendations in those areas, but certainly willing to take council comments if council disagrees or has other suggestions. So without further ado, I would like to move into the long-term land use planning and housing.
Do you also want to pull it up as well? Please.
Yes, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and just pull up, the work plans under long-term land use planning and housing. And I'm going to introduce this briefly, and because land use planning is Right up the alley of community development, our community development director, Rob Eastward, is going to help take the lead and present this item as well. But I did want to say with this one, as I talk about staff developing for you a hierarchy of what's important, this land use planning is a little bit of the dichotomy of that, the opposite of that, where we're going to be probably talking about things that can give. There's a lot in land use planning that's mandated now by our policies that we've just adopted, both in our general plan and our housing element, sets forth these work plans. But I'm going to turn over to Rob to at least walk us through some of those higher priority items and maybe some of those items that don't need to either be funded with the general fund or possibly with grant funds. So without further ado, I will introduce Director Eastwood to present.
Sure, absolutely. Good morning, Mayor Bybee, honorable council members, Rob Eastwood, Community Development Director. I'll put things in three broad buckets, and I hope you can hear me okay. So first is follow through on implementation of the general plan housing element. You'll remember 1 week ago today, we adopted the general plan housing element and a slew of accompanying ordinances. The next step is putting to work all the programs, policies, and plans that are within both of those documents. So to go through them briefly, under our housing element, we have a very aggressive commitment to policies and programs, very much focused on standing up affordable housing. And I'm not going to go deep into these, but under the near term, some of the things we're focusing on are modifying our inclusionary housing ordinance, looking at standing up a commercial linkage fee, which would collect monies the city can use to underwrite affordable housing. Standing up an affordable housing overlay zone, which would incentivize and allow more affordable housing in the city. Starting feasibility studies on potentially using the corporation yard for affordable housing, and investing in the homeless programs. So that's both standing up a home key project, which is a conversion of a motel into permanent supportive housing, and looking at hiring an unhoused coordinator. A lot of these things we'll come back to again, if not the next meeting, in 2 meetings. We actually had an outside audit of our housing program that looked at the housing elements, the management commitments we have in the program, the financial commitments are meeting, and that will come to you from an outside auditor that will be presented in 2 weeks. So a little bit of what the commitments are now, but you will get more insight into those recommendations on how to fund and put horsepower into those programs in about 2 weeks' time. Finally, last but not least, what a lot of cities have that underwrite, support, and actually produce affordable housing is an affordable housing trust fund. So we'll talk to you soon on ideas on how to seed that fund, grow that fund, and use it to help underwrite affordable housing projects. So that's in the housing bucket. Under the general plan zoning, 2 commitments in the near term. One is pursuing, creating and adopting the Hamilton Avenue Precise Plan. At this point, we've applied for not 1, but 2 state grants, and we're hoping at least between the 2 that can underwrite most of the work effort that goes into that. And then finally, the heavy lift that you had before you last week on zoning and residential design standards was focused on multifamily. We still have 1 left shoe to drop, which is our single family districts, and we intend to bring that back to you sometime later this week, in addition to a bunch of miscellaneous updates and probably corrections that are needed to the multifamily design standards. So broadly, bucket 1 is following through on all those commitments and focusing on the programs and actions that came out of the broad adoption last week. Bucket 2 is a little more thoughtful and forward thinking. If the housing element is successful, we are looking at development of somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 new housing units in the city. If you look at average household size, that projects out to 12,000 to 6,000 new residents in the city. And the question would be, do we have enough services, infrastructure support that growth in the city? 2 work efforts that we're trying to get ahead on that. One is we've applied for an open space grant to underwrite a master parks and recreation plan from the open space district. We are currently underparked, do not have sufficient park lands for population. And as that grows, that gap will be more than sufficient. So the intent of this is to provide a strategic plan on how the city can provide sufficient park land for our residents now and in the future. And 2, we applied for a sustainable transportation grant from the state to underwrite a multimodal plan. So today, most of the roads are saturated, not much room to expand if we grow the city and more people are needing to move around, drive, use bike and ped and other types of ways to get around. So the intent of this is to look holistically at how we can get folks around the city, if not only by car, but also by building out a bike and pedestrian system. So broadly, again, two big buckets. One is near-term focus on housing and general plan implementation, and two is thinking more into the future on trying to get ahead on planning for future growth of the city. And with that, I'll pause, and I'm not sure if now's the time for questions or.
Let me take finish up on that one. Thank you, Rob. So I also wanted to mention there was a discussion at the March 21st meeting about adding a priority or at least a council comment to consider a cannabis ordinance. And that wasn't one that was just highlighted in everything else we're doing in land use planning. And I pulled that out separately because I see this in really what do we need to do to move forward our general plan and housing element, and what do we voluntarily choose to do with regard to these work plans. And the cannabis ordinance is one of those that is not required that we do now. We haven't yet had the time to be able to analyze the long-term ongoing costs associated with that. I do know as we present this report that there will be some ongoing cost. The city had done some previous studies. Those are probably somewhat dated now. We'd want to update those. And we haven't painted the picture of what those personnel costs would be linked to that either at this point, because we haven't had time to fully develop that. So I distinguish that the council is still interested in that. Those are things that we choose to do now. And I point that out because in the vein of the discussion of tell us what you can get done and what you can't get done, there's a lot of heavy lift in this category on things that relating to housing, these multimodal plans, and land use things throughout the city. And while the cannabis would be a land use and be significant to the city, I'm sure it's something that we choose to do now. And I would put that in a secondary bucket in terms of what do we need to get done, what can we get done, and what do we choose to get done. And the council can tell me to raise that up on the priority list. But I distinguish that, and we would obviously develop if the council wants to move forward with that, without just coming to you with some analysis of what the ordinance process is. I'd want to fully flesh that out and be able to describe to you not only what that process looks like to adopt, but what the ongoing costs are to the city, and we would do so. But I just wanted to share that now in the context of the land use, that wasn't fully developed in this and what you're seeing today in those other items. When I say a dichotomy, that was the one that we weren't able to get the time and resources to actually develop that for today's discussion. Yeah, so if we're going to move on to the Measure O, and our Public Works Director is helping lead that project, certainly in coordination with the City Manager's Department, but I'm going to have Director Capurso present to you the Measure O work plans.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, Mayor and Council. So from a work plan perspective, Measure O is fairly straightforward. We're not really taking on any new efforts. Our main focus this year will be taking the projects from the design phase into the construction phase. And, you know, we had a study session on that not very long ago that hopefully catches you up on the progress of Measure O. As part of that construction, as the construction phase moves forward, we're certainly going to be, very interested in paying close attention to how we stage the construction on site. So you will get updates on that before the end of the fiscal year as we take the projects out to bid. And we will also be looking at, we'll continue to look at bringing in additional resources to either the existing projects that move forward or for some of the future work, which at this point is not specifically funded. So I know we had a discussion last time about some of the other improvements that remain to be done on site. We don't necessarily have resources allocated to that, but as you know, we have not yet allocated all of the Measure O funds. That's kind of pending how our bid process goes. So on top of all that, we will continue to report out the financial information as required. We do have the Measure O Oversight Committee, and we will be bringing back information to council before the end of the fiscal year. But as I say, our focus for fiscal year 24 is to move into the construction phase. And if the city manager has anything to add, I think we are good with Measure O.
Yes, and I will I will do the council. I will be going over the fiscal ability portion of the work plans. And also under these WHAG plans, they also can be broken into two groups. The first group is to continue and complete the hard plans that were approved for the current fiscal year 2023. But and also into group two is to take on a new council objectives to take on new council objectives through a new work and efforts to achieve those objectives. But under a broad description of the fiscal stability plans, it's really to do things to either be more cost effective, more cost efficient to take steps so that we're able to increase our income down the road, so that we are able to pay for also all of the things that we need to do. It's also to ensure that we're keeping up our buildings, our parks, our streets, that we're keeping up our infrastructure, so that we're able to decrease our ongoing repair costs. But also if you spend costs upfront to either upgrade or to replace something for building or parks or a street, it should be cheaper today than if you were to take on that same type of work down the road as well. It's also to address how we spend ARPA, but also to really get either enough internal or external help, either in consultants or our own personnel, to achieve these different council objectives and these different items. So just to go through a couple of the key ones, we will complete our a new HR and payroll program that is a continuation of the current year. We'll have the hope that if we're able to go away from an older paper-based program, that it should cut down on time and expense that we're also able to put elsewhere. It's also in the IT department to put into place certain types of security so that we're able to reduce our risk, and also to ensure that we aren't exposed, which also could help to control our expenses as well. It's also to put into place both a short-term and a long-term econ plan, so that we are able to also again take steps to increase our income down the road, so that we're able to pay for all the other things that we need to do. And then again in our department, it's really to build up the help and support that you would need to address first cause, to understand the best way to spend down ARPA funds, to work with CCD, but also all departments to pay for all of the all the things that you will need to address the housing element as well. So it's really building up that help and that support, so that you are able to address so that you're able to address all other council objectives as well. And I think that those are the key things that I was hoping to go through. So I will turn over.
Thank you, Will. The next section moving on is sustainability, and this is going to be a joint effort between our community development director and our public works director. And Rob Eastwood is going to lead us off in that discussion.
Well, again, I'll keep this pretty short. High on the council's strategy preferences for this year is starting work on a climate action plan. Ahead of that, knowing fiscal resources are limited, we've applied for a climate adaptation planning grant. Under the rules of the program, the grant can fund probably half of the work for the climate action plan. Proposal from staff is to have this be a holistic action plan, both looking at adaptation resilience, climate changes will happen, how are we more resilient in a changing climate, and a greenhouse gas reduction climate action plan that reduces our greenhouse gas emissions. We're hoping to hear back in summer on the disposition of the grant. Is pretty competitive. I rate our favorability not as high on this one. So we have put in the budget the total cost. We estimate $300,000 to underwrite and support the entire plan if we do not get the grant. But with that, that is on the work plan to start probably summer, fall of this year. We anticipate it being a probably 1 to 1.5, 2-year effort at most. And if that, of course, available for questions. Thank you.
Director Caperso is going to present the public works side of this sustainability priority.
Yes, just a couple things to add on that. Just a little more in the immediate implementation. I think the council is familiar. With hearing me. With the implementation of SB 1383 as we transition to a new solid waste hauler. And so SB 1383 has many changes associated with it. The most notable will be the implementation of the composting program. So as we move forward with our new hauler, even as we are closing out the current contract, you will see those changes to all of our residences and all of our businesses. And we have a role in helping manage that as part of the JPA. There are also some changing regulations coming our way in the realm of stormwater treatment, which we do have a work plan item on that as well. And the world is ever changing with regard to water conservation. So we've had work plan items about how to conserve water. We are actually going to be updating our work plan item here because even though the water supply looks good, we still need to be smart with our water use, and you will see that in our work plan, and you actually may see an item come to council relatively soon with regard to that as well. So with regard to environmental sustainability, I believe that's what we have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And then community health and safety is also going to be a joint effort. And I'm going to lead off with our police chief, Berg. He's going to present to us the public safety element to the community health and safety.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. I have 4 items that I wanted to discuss with you on work plans, and I'll separate them out into 2 that are ongoing and 2 that are proposed for next fiscal year if they're approved in the upcoming budget. The 2 that are currently occurring, you've heard me talk about, are recruiting and hiring for police officer and dispatch positions. Council has approved a budget for that this fiscal year, and you'll see in the upcoming budget increased funds for that. We're seeing great results in getting qualified applicants through the door, and we're excited about the prospect of that. But obviously that's a priority for us to fill these hard to fill positions. The second one that's currently ongoing that you've heard me talk about is related to crossing guards and collaboration with 2 school districts that we service, Moreland and Campbell Union School District. We have started those conversations about cost sharing efforts, been working with the city attorney's office on drafting a cost sharing agreement and contracting those services. The 2 proposed work plans that are waiting for approval through the budget would be the PERT clinician, the psychiatric emergency response team clinician, in dealing with mental health issues in our community, and that would be entering into an MOU with the county behavioral health to contract those services so that we could bring that support to the city of Campbell. And then the 4th item would be related to our emergency services coordination. And you'll see in the budget a proposed personnel request for that, since that's a very important position. We're currently going through our local hazard mitigation plan, and there's a lot of components to that to make sure that the city of Campbell is equipped to address any potential major emergencies in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Berg. And then Director Caperso again to help finish up on community health and safety.
And one thing that you will note, yes.
I'm having a hard time, Dan and I are having a hard time hearing Cecil, and our little mic is giving us a lot of feedback. So I don't know if there's something, I don't know if it's that mic or this. I don't know if it's because this now is with this.
It's just a lot of echo. Quality here, I'm sorry.
What would happen if you turned that off and Yeah, and listened or with the new microphones and see if that makes a difference.
This is not a receiver, it's a sender.
But
Hello, how is it now? Okay. Thank you. Just wanted to point out that many of the work plan items do not fit nicely in one category or another. So some of what we have in community health and safety actually dovetails on some other things that you've heard earlier today. So in public works, we certainly have a continuing item on the implementation of traffic calming measures, and we will be revisiting the traffic calming policy, but also looking at how to increase safety for both bicyclists and for pedestrians as we develop our safe route to school maps. And that does dovetail on what you heard Rob Eastwood talk about earlier about how we encourage multimodal travel. So as we look forward in how we can develop longer term plans, there will be some more immediate term implementation that goes along with that. So along those same lines, traffic calming, bike and ped safety, and then we are also instituting our battery backup system at our signalized intersections. So things like that are more easily implemented, but we will continue to plan for the longer term as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you able to hear? Do we? Okay, all right. We're learning these new speakers and we'll tune them accordingly. So if you have feedback, literally, let us know. So that brings us to the close of just a brief work plan presentation. As I said, that was just a synopsis in presenting what we see is important in the hierarchy of those. In the buckets that we put those in, we have a lot of staff here that also participate in the development of this. If there's questions of the council, we'd be glad to answer them. Now is a good time to sort of take a pause and reflect back on the work plans if there's council questions. We'll take feedback later in the meeting, but if there's questions.
questions of staff? Anyone want to begin? Councilmember Furtado?
I guess I'll ask some questions. This format is a little hard to follow here because we have to ask our questions all at once. But back to the land use, mention was made of the fact that we were working with a consultant, I think, on implementing elements of our housing plan. And so my question has to do with what would you expect the outcome of that to be? A format for planning for housing and affordable housing? That is one of the questions that I have. And then I'm assuming that we're going to get more detail later on the Hamilton Avenue precise plan. In other words, what I'd like to know is what is the desired outcome of that particular plan?
Sure, Councilmember Furtado. To both questions. So the housing element itself presents the sort of menu and a framework of the policies and programs we're investing for affordable housing. It doesn't provide all the details on how much staff is required and consultants. A lot of that will come to you, I believe it's the second meeting in May. We'll bring the audit to you, and we again hire an outside auditor, knowing that we have 0.4 FTE of a senior planner dedicated to our housing program, and the immensity of that program's in there, those two don't reconcile. So we have an outside auditor that came and reviewed our program, made recommendations on how to staff it properly, made recommendations on more resilient, sustainable funding sources. And a lot of the answers to your question, I don't want to steal her thunder. We'll come to you at the meeting in May, which will present recommendations on staffing for the program. But again, the housing element identifies the tools. Say, for example, one tool would be modifying our inclusionary ordinance to provide more inclusionary units, more affordable units. Another would be to adopt a linkage fee, which many cities have done. There's a small fee on commercial development, and we use those monies to support affordable housing. Those are just two tools, but the work to get there, generally say there's more to come, both in staffing and in timeline, and I can provide more details. Moving to question number 2, we'll hope to get out of the Hamilton Avenue precise plan. Right now, we're planning for about 1,200 to 1,500 housing units in and around the Hamilton 17 intersection. It's a very busy intersection, and we have a problem statement. On one side of the freeway, we have a light rail station, which is pretty new. On the other side of the freeway is most of the housing development. And some of the principles of putting housing there is allowing folks at least the opportunity to get to that light rail station so they can get to other places in the South Bay area. If you've ever walked across that intersection, it's not pleasant. That's probably the understatement of the year. The broad problem statement is as we invest a lot of housing into that area to have the infrastructure, i.e. a safe pedestrian crossing, better urban design to enhance that area to match the housing with the infrastructure and the light rail stations that's there. So the plan would lay out, and ideally we'd have a funding mechanism that is relying not only perhaps on grant funds or city funds, but also development impact fees. So as development happens there, they will get a fair share of the improvements needed to support the development.
I would imagine that if we're ultimately able to hire a housing manager, the results of the study that you just described or the results of the consultants would help guide the job description and some of the expectations of that position so that, quote, you choose the right person. What I mean is the right person who has the talent and the knowledge to sort of be able to manage that based on what the consultant might recommend.
Yeah, very much so. We've already done work with our HR manager on other housing manager job specs, anticipating this was coming. So we've done a lot of research both into the specs and the skills. Started to beat the bushes a little bit on potential talent that's out there, but to answer your question, yes.
And then in the finance area, one of the areas that this is more of a question actually, hope we might be able to see is sort of a chart or summary of like what the current unfunded pension liability is, and whatever plan we come up with, how are we going to address that in terms of if you ultimately had to predict, when we might sort of be fully caught up in that regard, how long would it take? I don't need an answer now, but I'm hoping that a plan that you might develop will ultimately reveal that so that we sort of have a roadmap of where we're going and how successful we are. And sometimes with good funding or poor funding in a given year, you can put in more or less. And so I'm sort of making those assumptions if you think I'm correct.
No. I run correct. And under our current high plan for the current year, it's also to address our unfunded pension costs. There's not enough time in the current year to fully address pension costs. So we're proposing that we can continue it into the upcoming year. But the idea it'd be to discuss and show to council the total projected amount of our unfunded pension costs. Also, how they're expected to change over the next 10 to 20 years, and also to propose a couple of different, a couple of different ideas about how they could be addressed and paid down. You either could do a big upfront payment occurs. There are things that you could do to also set an amount aside each year that you could put in a trust to earn a return. So I won't go too far into the choices, but it's a thing that we're proposing to address also in the coming year, to go through those different things that the council hopes to see.
I'm sorry, I have one more question
Sure,
for
go right ahead.
this time for Public Works. Our a pavement management index is, I think, around 69 or so right now. Do you have hopes or plans for possibly increasing our level into the more moderate category, into the 70s or something like that? That's one question. And the second question I'll go ahead and ask has to do with our lighting and landscaping. And as traffic increases, well, I know as we basically maybe get more housing, do you think we will be able to have a more robust system that will actually kind of look at traffic patterns more carefully and sort of improve the flow through traffic signals right now that don't seem to be all that responsive to whether there's someone in the queue or not, and maybe improve the flow more in line with what's happening right at that moment, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you for those questions. In terms of the pavement condition index, you probably know that we are largely funded by external funding sources at this point, and we are in far better shape than we were probably 5 years ago, since the passage of SB1 has occurred. So we're now doing close to $3 million a year in pavement maintenance, but like many other things that our finance director referred to earlier, asset management is an ongoing effort. And oftentimes you don't have enough resources to keep you at that level. And what it will take to raise the level sometimes is a one-time increase in funding, because there are some large projects out there that contribute to that. So with the current resources, we are continuing to alternate between rehabilitation projects on the arterials. You saw a few years ago that we did Winchester. We are now under design for Hamilton. And in the intervening years, we will do more Cape Seal and Slurry Seal type projects on the residential streets. That is essentially going to keep us afloat. And I will say that with that current plan and the current level of funding, we'll be right around 70. You could maybe go slightly above and then come back slightly below. It really depends what cycle you're on between arterials and the collectors and local streets. But I would not expect a significant change in that one way or another without an increase in resources. So I would expect us to hover right around 70. And that's really our goal at this point with the resources that we have. I will also add that we continue to look at bringing in grants to supplement our larger projects. We brought in some OBAG funding on the Winchester project. The council did receive an email from the city manager just recently that we are still under consideration for some additional funding for the Hamilton project. Things like that, if they bear out, will certainly increase our ability to raise that PCI, because in the case of Hamilton, if we don't get that additional funding, we're basically going to use up to 4 years of our annual funding to rehabilitate Hamilton. And if we do get that funding, we're going to use 2 years of our own funding, and then we'll be able to return to our residential and I should say local and collector streets. So all things being equal, we're going to hover right around 70. With regard to the flow of traffic, we have invested in some ITS type projects that are enhancements along the specific corridors. We've done a timing study not very long ago that focused on Bascom and Hamilton. And that has its pluses and minuses because it really is geared toward AM commute and it's geared toward PM commute. And so there are winners and losers in those sort of timing studies, right? So we're doing our best to help traffic flow as efficiently as it can. You heard the reference earlier to the whole Highway 17 and Salmar area, which carries a lot of traffic. I think, from my perspective, it does that in a fairly efficient manner. Some people that sit in that every day would probably not agree with me, but I think if you watch the operations of that intersection, it does a really good job at helping clear out. But it's a volume issue is what we have. And that's why we need to invest in more multimodal improvements. So making connections to the light rail station and increasing our bike and ped facilities will be so important. Most of our signalized intersections are on video detection. So they should be detecting you. If they're not detecting you, please let us know. We do have a few of the older systems that still run on traffic loops, and we are in our long-term plan is to convert those, but we have not converted them all. And I guess the other thing that I'll add about the east-west corridors in the city is that during commute times, the timing of those corridors is largely tied to San Tomas Expressway. Because what you don't want to do is create a situation where we're really allowing cars to move through Campbell and they hit the expressway and they come to a dead stop for 3 or 4 minutes. So our timing changes throughout the day based on AM commute, PM commute, and the cycle timing that's being used out on the expressway. And so we are in pretty close coordination with the county on those, but in some cases the system does get overwhelmed, and we're not likely to build any new roads or widen any roads. So it's really a factor of us trying to move cars as efficiently as we can.
Thank you. And we are paving Old Camden this year. Great. Thank you.
Vice Mayor?
Okay, Todd, I guess to start. How much have we spent this year in traffic calming? There were so many numbers to go through. I'm going to have a question for you, Rob, in a minute. Don't go anywhere.
I could not give you that number off the top of my head. I'd have to run a report on that.
Because last year we allocated 100,000, and this year we're only allocating 50,000.
Yes, I think part of what happened last year is that there was a carryover from, it really wasn't 100,000. There were 2 previous allocations of 50, and we had spent the majority of one of those. So from the budgetary perspective, it looked like 100, but really that older one had been spent down. And then we completed a project over this last year on Sobrado. Yeah, out on Sobrado. So I want to say that has brought it down probably by about 20,000 or so.
Okay, so you think the 50 is going to be enough for the following year, especially if we're going to rewrite the policy? I think more people are going to come forward.
Well, that's an interesting question, because traffic calming, I think many of you know, isn't just about people coming forward. It's about the road qualifying based on the criteria. So I think you are familiar with the fact that many people come forward. And because if you ask the average person off the street whether their street needs traffic calming, most people would say yes. The criteria as we have it, you know, it's got a fairly respectable volume and speed requirement. So there are many streets where the neighbor or a single neighbor comes forward and it doesn't meet the criteria. If it does meet the criteria, we still need to have a neighborhood process where the neighborhood kind of buys into it, so to speak, and we take a vote. And that's a fairly, I don't want to say intense, but it does take some resources to go through that. So you probably are not in a position to do a dozen of these a year. I think the best case scenario is you could do 3 or 4 a year. And I think the resources that we're asking for now would allow us to continue. But I think if we go through the exercise of revisiting the criteria and the policy, we could always come back to council and say, we've run out of money, we need more, or we could revisit that in next year's CIP to be more commensurate with the policy.
Okay, and then why are we showing $2.3 million for the community center and the courtyard roof replacement if we're looking at potentially moving the courtyard? Which I don't want.
Can I interrupt for just a moment? I think we're in the section discussion on work plans and not into the capital plan yet. They haven't presented the capital plan.
They talked about these projects. Okay,
Okay.
I'm on the page of the capital plan, so which page should I be on? Because I have marks here.
So I think, could we hold the question until we get to the capital plan? Because again, we're talking about the work plans that the staff just presented, and if there's any specific questions about those before we get into the capital and the
Okay,
budget.
so we're just on the part where the text.
The work plans.
Okay, sorry,
Yes.
I'm in the wrong. Okay, let me go back. Oh, shoot. Okay, under the comprehensive inventory and condition assessment of all city facilities, is that where the ADA upgrade study of some of the ADA upgrade study will be part of that?
It will be, yes, it will have a higher level of ADA assessment. It's not a CASP assessment, but it is included in our building assessment. There will be a higher level of ADA evaluation.
Okay, so let me see then. So Rob, my question's on the next topic. I think that's it on the, okay, sorry for that. That's it then.
Thank you. Councilmember Lopez?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Todd, this is probably most appropriate for you. I know when we had the priority setting session, we had some discussion that there could potentially be different ways of gauging the parks metric from what we're using, that can maybe be updated. I heard Rob make reference to the current policy. So I'm just wondering, are we still looking at updating those figures? I know it'll probably take a little more time in research, but has there been any more thinking that's gone into assessing that?
Well, I think that's a pretty open-ended discussion, to be honest. I mean, we do have a standard in the general plan. I don't know that it's proposed to change going forward. So we're still at the 3 acres per thousand. I think what would help is what you heard Rob talk about earlier, is the fact that we've applied to have a kind of a park master plan, a park deficiency study done. And if and when we move forward with that, I think that would be a good place for us to revisit that. But I also think that maybe it's not necessarily just on the standard side. It's probably on the supply side, if I could call it that, because historically we've only looked at parks that we own, maintain, and manage. And I think we all know that there are other facilities in this area. We have county parks. We have a couple of San Jose parks. We have some school sites that remain open after hours, and we have some that don't. And some of those provide recreational opportunities. And some of where maybe we are not as deficient as we might think we are would be to make ourselves available of some of those facilities. So I do think that if we can move forward with this study, it will help us. But I do think we've got to look at both the standard side and what's available to us in terms of our park facilities.
And the reason I ask, I don't think it's just an academic question, but it's going to have implications for what kind of projects and where we choose to take them on. And so that's kind of why I bring it up now, because it would be more prudent to have that rather than updating later and saying, oh, well, we put in the wrong place or we focused on the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Because it's not necessarily a calculation that says if we have 3 acres per 1,000, we need X amount of acres. And if we built them all in one corner of the city, they're really not available to residents across the city. I can tell you that I think we are aware that there are some park deficient areas of the city. And typically when you do a park study like this, you not only look at what is your acreage or what's your facility inventory in total, but you look at what park facilities are available within a half-mile to 3/4 mile walking radius. And so I think some of you may have seen the map from the older general plan that when you lay those out, we've got some more park deficient areas of the city. They do tend to be out on the west side. And there's probably some opportunity sites out there that maybe we could work with the school district or two to see, even if we can't buy land and develop it, there may be some partnerships but again, I think it's easy for me to say that, not knowing, what the best strategy would be overall. So I'm really hopeful that we can bring those resources in and move forward with that. But I think that would be part of that whole discussion and evaluation.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate it. And I think if there are, I think that broader study is really important. I think in the meantime, if we're considering other opportunities, just to apply that level of strategic thinking that you're talking about would be really prudent. Thank you. And then next question is for the city manager. The approach for a potential marijuana ordinance that you laid out and the different considerations make sense. I guess my question is just, given those kind of limitations, which I know are very real right now on our resources, given everything that you said, if nothing else changes, what kind of time frame would you envision for us further considering that? Even just generally speaking.
Yeah, I think generally the city attorney is on his current work plan is going to be working on an ordinance update just to comply with state law anyway. There'll be an opportunity to have some discussion related to that. We had mentioned that. But for the greater study of an ordinance to allow for that, with all things that we're seeing here, it would be my recommendation that we defer that to next fiscal year. To start that study perhaps in the spring, late spring next year, or even into the next fiscal year. And it's just a matter of, as we talk about those, in my mind, prioritizing what we got to get done and what we're voluntarily choosing to get done. Not that those aren't important things. That's why we're choosing to do them. But as far as what we can get done first, I would put that below some of those other things that Rob mentioned in the list. If this council's interested, we would fully flesh those out and put those into this budget year to start in the spring next year, or even defer it to next fiscal year.
And I'm okay with that as long as as there is some consideration of when it would come forward. I just don't want it to end up in limbo because it was on and it's not, and it's kind of this ambiguous status. But I understand those limitations.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that we just drop it, the thought process. It's just a matter of prioritizing and when we can get to things. And to me, that's we'll get to that when we get some substantial progress on those other things. And just to be real blunt, like I said, I think it would be spring next year, if not next fiscal year. But we can certainly commit to bringing that forward next year.
Yeah, and I think that's realistic and appropriate. But great, I appreciate the clarification. That's all.
Thank you. And I just want to double check to see if Councilmember Scazola ever checked in. He texted and said he was going to be okay. So I have one question of Chief Burke, and it's related to the behavioral health, the PERT clinician. And I know that the Board of Supervisors recently approved funding to expand the trust program into the West Valley cities for support for the mobile health crisis team that responds. Is this program that's being presented separate from that, or can it work in conjunction with the trust program?
So mobile mental health and trust are very different programs from PERT. PERT is actually a clinician that's employed by county behavioral health that would be embedded in our police department and partnered with a police officer and available to respond to active calls for service. Trust is made up of volunteers, and there's some behind the scenes discussions going on because there's really a lack of coordination with law enforcement on the trust side of things. And we do work with mobile mental health, but the purpose of the PERT clinicians, it serves a very different purpose from either of those two. It's really a partnership with the police department for calls for service.
And is there opportunity to do a cost sharing with that, or would the city be completely funding the PERT clinician?
So over the last several years, the county has funded other PERT clinicians throughout the county. I've been told that their grant funding for those programs has ended, and it sounds like they're prioritizing funding trust and other things. So I know other agencies are in a similar spot that we are, that if there's an interest, then the individual city needs to fund it and contract.
Okay, thank you. And if there are no other questions, we'll move on back to the city manager to present the budget, the operating budget.
And we'll certainly, thank you. And we'll certainly cover when we get through the CIP discussion, we will talk more about ARPA funding specifically. And I know that was in the interest of the council. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Director Fuentes to go ahead and present the high level of the operating budget.
All right. So I think that you touched certainly upon the key points. If we were to keep everything the same, but also to adjust our inflation, but also all of our costs that we know will increase, but also to take into account that in terms of income, that we've really recovered and come a long way since COVID. So if you take into account our current cost structure, also the expectations that our income, it's also growing. There's expected to be about a 2.5 million surplus. If again, if you were to take all of those new either one-time recurring or personnel requests into account, that would turn into a $3.8 million opposite. But I mean that also does assume that we put forth each of the new requests, but also that they're all paid for. They're all paid for through the general fund. But in terms of the new on-time recurring and the new personnel request, we've shown the council how does the expected cost of the new request tied to the council objectives as well. So we're certainly proposing to put the biggest amount into the fiscal ability, so that we are able to build, you know, that good fiscal foundation, so that you're able to take on additional council objectives and goals, both in the upcoming year, but also down the road. It's to help to, you know, say address PERS, to address the way that we do purchasing, but to also to address the so that we're able to build up our ongoing income, to again pay for all of the things that we unpaid to do, but also all of the things that we want to do that are under our control. So with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to you, Brian.
Okay, so in the operating budget, I wanted to just walk through these three different areas that's shown on the screen here. The one-time requests, the reoccurring requests and the personnel requests and help provide some structure to the discussion here on these. And the one-time requests are specifically, as it's mentioned here, intended to try to meet the council priorities or operational needs. There tend to be contractual services or studies that are going to be done. They also can include system implementation expenses that are one-time expenses, and you'll see those. And then also, not to be lost in this, it includes CIPR projects where CIPR funding is not adequate to support. And I just wanted to take a moment to explain just how our CIPR works for council members that may not be familiar with that. That our CIPR is essentially an extension of our general fund. As we talk about CIP, those are our capital improvement projects, and we will talk about those separately. Those CIP projects can be funded by grant funds. They can be funded by restricted revenues, such that Director Capurso mentioned, such as SB1 or gas tax money that has to be spent on certain things. But we also support our CIP projects out of our general fund. And so there's choices we make as we're making choices on work plans, and we're making choices on the operating budget and these one-time needs. There's certainly CIPR funds being used for projects that we've identified that aren't sufficiently funded through other revenue sources, and we'll highlight those for you. And I wanted to just go ahead and, let's go ahead and go into the one-time costs, and then I'll talk about reoccurring costs next. Okay, so in your report under, let's see here, this is attachment D. And that's what we have displayed on the screen. It's rather small on the screen, so we can enlarge it if that's helpful. This attachment D lists all of these one-time expenditures by department, what they're there for. And I want to stress that with this, that there's $3.8 million worth of one-time request. And while most of these have been correlated with their priority, you can see the colors there. The ones that are white with no color are operational needs, but those with colors are certainly correlated with the priorities. And so even as we see most of them correlated with priorities, $3.8 million is a heavy lift. And of those $3.8 million, approximately 2/3 of it are in two categories. One, that about 1/3 of that amount is in grants or one-time application projects, as shown here on, let's see, this is page 19 of the packet. And you can see here the large expenses starting with climate action plan and the citywide multimodal transportation plan, the Hamilton Avenue Precise Plan, and the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Those are about $600,000 for those items. And you can see in those notes, these are primarily, we're looking for grant funds to help heavily support this. I think Director Eastwood and Director Capurso both touched on these. The citywide multimodal plan is a big item that we're hoping for grant funds for. A small city match of about $78,000, but a very large item you see is $650,000. It would be our proposal that if those grant funds aren't successful, we defer that to next fiscal year as far as the priorities go. And likewise, as we sort of hold our breath for some of these other grants that require city match funds, those may make those cost estimates you see come down. We've given you the fully loaded costs as if we're not going to get grants. So you see that in the notes columns, we sort of rate what we think the chance of getting grant funds are for those, medium, low, or high. And so that's about 1/3 of your one-time expenses. And another third of the one-time expenses, if we go down in this chart, have to do with those CIPR funds. These are projects that would normally be in your CIP and that we don't have other dedicated funds to. So when we use CIPR again, what we're essentially doing is just it's just an expense out of your general fund, just like any other operational item. We would transfer into the CIPR a sufficient amount to fund these projects. And I believe if I look at this, it really starts with the, let's see here, the replacement. If you see the item here, it's in white that says replacement of storage area network systems. And then you go down in the chart through the end of this chart. Those are all CIPR projects. Those also equate to about 1.6 million for those items in total approximately. And I'm just using roundabout math to keep us at a high level here. So about 600,000 in project studies, grants that may be related to grants. Either we would propose we defer if we don't get grants, or that those costs would go down if we could get grants. And then the remainder of them are these capital improvement projects at 1.6 million. And those are the big ticket items. So one of the discussions that we're going to have after we talk about CIP is ARPA funds. And ARPA funds isn't the solution for everything. I know if we had our preference, we would probably have spent that 10 times over on many, many things that we think are important. But when we talk about funding sources, we're talking about not only our general fund, but we're talking about whether we can pursue grant funds or outside revenue sources, or use of ARPA funds for one-time expenses, not ongoing operating costs associated with any program or improvement. And that's a discussion. We're just going to put a pin in that and come back to that. But that there may be a way to look at a combination of those grant funds and ARPA in a strategic fashion. Not to say that we have to use ARPA to fund all of these, but that would be one potential funding source. I just want to highlight that now and kind of put a pin in that. We'll come back to when we talk about ARPA here in a few minutes. And then the remainder out of that 3.8 million is other priorities, work plans, operational needs, new programs, or and I'll leave it at that because I want to get into the reoccurring requests next. So with the reoccurring requests, that's about 1.10 million. That's a little bit easier to dissect because it's a little bit more straightforward. It does not include contractual increases already calculated in the status quo that we gave you. These are non-personnel related, but may include temporary personnel. So not permanent staffing, but certainly temporary. And so here in attachment E in the packet, our finance directors put this up on the screen for me. Here you could see the ongoing expenditures that are related to particular priorities or operational needs. I just wanted to highlight those that are $100,000 or more for purposes of just our discussion here. We can certainly answer questions or discuss any of these. In that category is a proposal to increase our recruitment efforts related to our police department and supplemental recruiting to help get qualified candidates. And then the other item underneath that is the contracted mental health clinician at 100,000. This is in addition to the citywide clinician. This current fiscal year, this council has given us some funds, both on the PD side and the citywide side to support mental health of our employees and our police officers. This would be in addition to what we've done in the past. Dedicated in particular to PD. request for a public, I'm sorry, move past that, the request for the per clinician at 180,000. And that was the item that Mayor Bybee and Chief Berg were speaking about a few minutes ago. And then not to be lost in all of that, as you go down this chart down towards the bottom, you see, this is where I mentioned the CIPR set aside. This shows in your operating budget as an ongoing reoccurring expense. So we're proposing to actually increase the amount of money that we're contributing to our CIPR by doubling it. Currently at 275,000, the proposal to increase that to 550,000, but we have choices. And so in that chart above where you saw all those CIPR things that we, in the one-time costs that we want to get done and we don't have money for, here, we're trying to create some of that and show that revenue source coming into the CIPR for the general fund. That number could always be higher, but in the discussion that we're having of what's got to give, I did want to point out to that is an increase in that. So those two things are linked together there. And then moving on into the permanent staffing request in the budget is attachment F. And, you know, I wanted to talk about this in the sense of our priorities because what we've given you is everything that we think that we need, not only to support council priorities, but also the work plans, any operational needs we have, support new programs, and also account for potential future growth. And all of those things, if you see on this slide here, are a way to sort of prioritize those. And it would be my suggestion that those with minimal fiscal impacts, and those are things, personnel changes, alterations, reclassifications, that would be what I call minimal fiscal impacts. Those are less than $5,000 impact. To me, those are the easy ones, and I would suggest those are a higher priority just because they're not going to move the needle on our general fund dramatically. If we believe they need to get done, I would suggest that we go ahead and do those. The tier 2, which would be my second priority, would be those that are related to the council studies. These are things like climate action plan that may result in personnel request. There are things like the housing study that we've already talked about that Director Eastwood mentioned. You're going to get a report on in May on our audit of our housing program, and inevitably as part of that, we already know there's going to be a recommendation for some staffing. The economic development plan. We already have a current position that is funded as an economic development specialist, but we know from what we're understanding in that economic development study that's still yet to come to the council that there will be a recommendation, probably increase that staffing, or at least the level of that staffing to a higher level position. So those studies, I put in another bucket. One, those are things that were important to the council to study. And I put a pin in those and hold that a little bit because we're going to report back to the council on those studies. And I think making a decision on whether we fund those positions now wouldn't make sense until you have those studies and understand what you're going to get out of that and what the tasks are that they're going to be achieving. And so if the council chooses at those times to fund those would be the second priority in that list. And then certainly last, I call tier 3. I've organized these tier 3 priorities. If we can actually maybe can you go back to this slide here in the PowerPoint? Thank you. Here under tier 3, these are in priority order. So why tier 1 is I would suggest is a higher priority than tier 2, which is a higher priority than tier 3. As you read from left to right, I would suggest an order of priorities are anything else that's related to council priorities, and then in descending order of priority, anything that's related to our work plans, anything that's related to an operational need. And then last in that priority order would be anything that supports a new program, something that we're adding up and above what we've done, or supports future growth, and sort of those priority orders. And I suggest that just to keep us at a high level, because certainly, and we'll take comments and questions on each and every one of these positions that we put in there. We wanted to paint the picture of everything we think we need, but give you some hierarchy of our thought process as we take today's input and then develop a balanced budget of how we would propose bringing forward those personnel requests in this priority order to meet a balanced budget. And those that would exceed that dollar amount would be those of lesser priority. So future growth. Obviously, in my mind, that would be a lesser priority because that's something that hasn't happened yet. And while we want to be proactive, if we can't meet the needs of today, I would suggest that perhaps we should defer trying to meet the needs of tomorrow until we can kind of get through today. And so that was my thought process there. And I'm more than happy to take questions on that. And we're going to do so. And then certainly we're going to go through after this operating budget, the CIP and the ARPA discussion. And then we're going to take public comments and then get council feedback in each of these areas. So right now it would be appropriate to take any questions on the operating budget with anything we presented or anything we didn't present that you still had questions on.
I'll start with any questions. Councilmember Furtado.
So we can ask questions not only in the dollar amounts, but on the attachment E and F. Okay. I'll have more to say when we get to the point where the council will actually discuss this, but in terms of questions right now, I would like, well, I'll phrase this in a question then. Can we have a further discussion, not today, but sometime, regarding the position of a contracted mental health clinician and the PERT clinician? I know there was a comment that they are separate, but I'm wondering if we could have a discussion whether those two positions could actually be vested in one person rather than two.
Do we want to respond today or?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a question, I guess, if we could discuss it further, not now, but sometime in the
Yeah,
future.
the simple answer is with the council's discretion. Yes, we could easily discuss that at a future meeting.
Okay. Then I have a question regarding under tier 2, this is finance, the potential to add a purchasing agent, but in the comments, it also says one purchasing agent and later a buyer. Is it really envisioned that we would ultimately have two people? I mean, I must confess, I can't really give you a good description of the difference between a purchasing agent and a buyer. It seems like that would be like one person rather than one plus one later. Am I misinterpreting that?
So the intention would be to put in a purchasing agent upfront to really build out the purchasing program. We just used an outside consultant to really go through the whole program to give us some ideas of what we would need to change, to improve, to put in a place, and so the outcome of purchasing that purchasing review, it was two FTEs, a purchasing agent who is really the expert in purchasing, who is able to work with all of the different departments to address their purchasing needs. And then a buyer who is really that boots on the ground type a role that would also work with different companies to get them the best prices. But the intention is to really to get that purchasing agent role in place up front. They can continue to build up the program, but also to really determine whether or not we do indeed need a additional FTE. The deal that we had, but they're also coming. They're also coming from the outside. So if you've got that internal purchase agent who's say in the a job for a 12 a month, then they also can help to determine whether or not we would indeed need a additional person or not. So we're only doing a request for the purchase agent today, but depending upon their work, but also what they need to excel in the role, then there may be a need for that additional FTE down the road. So we will return to council also to share the consultant report, so that you are able to see the full details. We intend to bring that to council on May 16th, so that you are able to see those full details as well.
Thank you. One last question about on the last page there talks about recreation supervisor. I was a little confused about, it says it's going to bump it up to a full-time position, but in the comments it says reclass the current PT employee to full-time based on workload and so on, but the position would still remain part-time. So that's a little confusing to me.
Good morning. So the museum supervisor voluntarily did a reduction from a 1.0 to a 0.75 many years ago, which is equivalent to 30 hours per week. And then based on workload and personal changes that she's looking to switch her position back to 35, and then in the following year back to a full-time position, which is the classification. So we're going from 30 to 35 hours per week this year.
Vice Mayor Landry?
I don't know if I missed it in here, but under the page, it says preliminary budget summary. It's non-departmental under expenses to the tune of 9 million this year and 6 million. What is non-departmental?
So it will be the part of the general fund that helps to either pay for the CIPR expenses, but also if there are any non-general funds that also don't got enough to pay for either their ongoing expenses, but also anything in those particular funds that could be a one-time expenses as well. So it could be in say the IT fund or the fleet fund, just a different funds that there may not be enough in them to cover the anticipated expenses. So for any non-general fund, if they aren't able to cover their expenses in any in a year, then those expenses by default get covered by the general fund. So it's by putting it into by putting the amount into a budget up front, you know what you'll need. What you expect to also cover all those non-general fund expenses. And so it can also change from a year we've attempted to keep the amount low, but it can also change as well.
Okay, and then for Todd, why is the senior engineer only 0.75 full-time and not full-time? And that's a consultant, right? Where'd it go here?
At this point, it's really an estimate based on where we end up with the CIP.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah, exactly. The main point of us proposing that is that if we are going to add projects to the CIP above and beyond what's budgeted in the resources that we have, and you're going to hear a little bit more from that from Nora here in just a little bit, that at some point you do hit the limits of staff capacity, right? And it will depend on the type of the project. If we end up with the focus more on facilities type improvements, it might not even be an engineer. It might be a different classification. Our goal here was just to highlight the fact that if we move forward with any significant amount of capital projects above and beyond what we would show through the normal funding sources, that we will need additional project management resources. And so the 0.75 is a good place to start. That could go higher or lower or change classifications depending on where we end up. But the notion would be that we would need to program that into the operating budget, even though that position may charge against the project as the projects move forward. but you still need to budget for the classification.
And it's a consultant or a regular employee?
At this point, we have proposed it as a regular employee.
Okay. And I think that's it for questions right now.
I have a couple questions on attachment D. The first one is to Will on the digitizing of the paper records. So it says use a vendor to scan. Is that in conjunction with the Laserfish system, or is it a separate system that you're scanning and using a vendor to hiring a vendor to do that?
So the intention would be to put it would be to put it into the Laserfish program. So let's happy to get some outside help. I would say for just a couple of months to go through everything in a paper, either in a payroll, AP, our whole department. Away from a fair amount of paper that we've kept, and certainly in payroll, we do need to continue to keep it, but we don't currently got enough internal time. So it would again to have some outside temp help to turn it into digital.
So it's actually having temporary help to scan into a system that we already have and not a new system that we're creating.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, correct.
And then the next questions I have are for Todd. Related to there's a lot of items in the one-time expenditures for routine maintenance type projects like replacing carpet, finishing hardware floor. What is the process to identify those and prioritize those in a given year? Is there a process?
Yes, there is. There's a process that actually starts relatively early in the budget process, where finance opens up a request system for facilities improvements, for fleet changes, and for IT changes, all of the kind of internal services. And from the fleet and facility side, the ones that Public Works has a role in, we certainly review those. We work with the requesting department. In this particular case, I think you will see that most of these, well, maybe not most, but it's usually a combination of what comes from the community center and from City Hall. Mm-hmm. And we do evaluate whether or not the need is real, and if so, is the budget figure approximately correct as we move forward, and then we make a recommendation on whether or not those should be included in the operating budget. Now, typically, what happens in past years when we haven't had this detailed of a discussion about the constraints of the general fund is we generally will move forward and propose these smaller projects as part of the building maintenance operating budget. And then we move forward over the course of the year and we take care of those. Because we're having this more detailed discussion about one-time expenses, we've actually pulled those out because they would be on the list, and we would like you to consider those in comparison to everything else on this list. But that's really the process, and it's usually a combination. What makes these projects a viable project is a combination of things, right? So sometimes we have aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced. Sometimes we have an aesthetic issue if it's painting and or carpet. And then sometimes it's a programmatic issue in that we need to make improvements, particularly at the community center, to be more in alignment with the programs that will be offered out there. But yes, there is an evaluation process before these get proposed.
Okay, and is it strictly limited to interior or exterior building conditions? And the reason I ask is I noticed some things, walking around City Hall that really could use some upgrade and be on the list. So how would a council member provide input to that process?
Well, I hear
Without
you right
saying,
now.
Todd, go out and do this.
So we hear you loud and clear. I think some of those types of improvements are things that we can do with some of our ongoing resources. As you probably know, we do annual painting, we do some annual roof work, and we prioritize that against the resources that we have. So I think there is certainly going to be a need for us to look at certain facilities maybe a little more closely than some others. We've talked internally here about the condition and the aesthetics related to City Hall, particularly as it's going to be surrounded by two very new looking buildings in the next couple of years. So we understand that at the very least, maybe some painting, some roofing, and some landscaping improvements might be in order. Unfortunately, you don't see those in the proposed budget for this year, but those are certainly something that we will put together and bring back before council.
Okay. And my last question has to do with the chiller replacement. And it seems like every couple years we're putting in proposals to replace the chiller, and we spend a lot of money to do that. And it seems like so the replacements that we've done to date, are they not sufficient in providing the correct heating and air conditioning for the building?
We haven't replaced anything significant here on this wing of City Hall, and it needs it, right? And so that, I think anybody that's had a council meeting here in a heat wave or when it's been really cold just knows that the system here lags, and it lags significantly, right? So that is why we're proposing this. Something like that would also likely show itself in a condition, in a facility condition assessment, with which we're moving forward in. So whether we fund it in the current year or not, it's certainly going to show itself as being something that does, we do have some elements of all our assets that sometimes preventive maintenance can extend the useful life of the asset, but sometimes preventive maintenance is not enough, and you really have a capacity issue, and that's what I believe we have here at City Hall.
So have we been doing preventative maintenance since the last time that the chiller was replaced?
We have.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Sure. So at this point, before we get into the CIP presentation, we're going to take a 10-minute break. 5-minute break. So I'd like to call the meeting back to order, and we'll go back to our city manager with the CIP presentation.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to turn it over to our finance manager, Nort Vong, to walk through CIP. And I think this is going to be a concerted effort also along with Public Works. So Nort, you've got the floor.
Thank you, City Manager. I appreciate it. Good morning, Council. My name is Nort Vong, Finance Manager for the city. I will be providing you just a brief overview of our capital improvement plan for this budget cycle. As you're aware, staff prepares an updated CIP on an annual basis, which covers a 5-year period. The CIP that we're proposing or presenting on is covering fiscal year 24 through fiscal year 28. The CIP in total amounts to just over $95 million, which is made up of both new requests as well as existing or previously approved projects. In terms of our new capital projects for this budget cycle, it amounts to about $7.6 million. In total, there are about 19 new CIP requests. Of the $7.6 million, there are 2 projects that make the majority of this amount. The first project being the annual street maintenance project for fiscal year 28, which amounts to just under $3 million. And the second project is something that we've heard about in the previous presentations, which is related to the roof replacement within the courtyard as well as the community center. Both these projects amount to about $5.7 million, and you'll see that in the CIP schedules further along the staff report. As it relates to our existing capital projects, or previously approved projects, that amounts to just over $87 million. A good majority of that relates to the Measure O project. While we call it Measure O, staff would like to also mention that that project also has about $9 million of outside funding as well. In total right now in available funding, there's about $56 million available. And as it relates to the requested funding for fiscal year 2024 out of this 5-year CIP, staff is requesting an additional $9.6 million for various projects to be funded in fiscal year 24. Last but not least, I want to just provide just a quick update on the changes to CIP as it compares to what was approved in the prior year. This is outside of the new capital request. The first change is to our annual street maintenance project, which originally spanned from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 25. For this budget cycle, we are requesting to add fiscal year 26 as part of the larger project. Fiscal year 26 was originally a standalone project, and now it's being added to the fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 25 annual street maintenance plan project. The second change that we have to the CIP is related to the annual street maintenance project for fiscal year 27, where we are requesting an additional $200,000 that is fully offset by an increase in revenue to SB1. So that'll be a net zero effect in terms of the effect of that project. We're also requesting an additional $100,000 increase to our sidewalk, curb, and gutter improvement project for fiscal year 24. And last but not least, we have 2 project deferrals from fiscal year 24 to fiscal year 25 for the Campbell Avenue Page Street traffic signal project, as well as the parking guidance system. And so this concludes just a brief overview of the CIP, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. And we also have Todd to assist as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nort. Questions of council? Councilmember Furtado.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned under CIP about Measure O, but you know, it has its total separate funding. So why would we be talking about it under CIP, or is that just how you sort of account for it, I guess?
Sure. Within the CIP program, we typically like to include any improvements or maintenance that covers about over $25,000 or covers a 5-year period. And so in this case, because the Measure O project is a significant and material project, it is included within the CIP. The capital improvement plan covers not only general fund funded projects, but it covers projects that are funded by other funding sources as well, such as Measure O, which is bond proceeds, any grant funded projects, park fees, things of that nature. So it encompasses the whole city's capital improvement plan.
Would you just repeat again what you kind of said at the very beginning? I know you mentioned Measure O, but there was one other project you talked about funding, I think this year. Maybe I kind of misunderstood that.
Sure. Initially, I mentioned there are two significant requests that are new for this budget cycle. The first one being the annual street maintenance project that we have on an annual basis that we fund annually, that is covered by CAPR, SB1 gas tax, and other grants as well. And then we also have the courtyard and community center roof replacement, which has been mentioned in the operating budget presentation as well. Both of those projects amount to about 5.7 million out of the 7.7 that is being requested.
Okay, yes, and I don't mean to steal the question that Susan was going to ask, but under the courtyard roof replacement, I actually saw two figures. In one place, it was like for 275,000 or something, and in another place, it was a huge number. I'm a little confused about that, but then I also, and this part of the question may relate to Todd, but my question was similar to yours, Susan. Why would we be putting a lot of effort in roof replacement at the courtyard if our intention ultimately is to consider moving it elsewhere?
Thank you for that. So there's a couple things going on there that you asked about, council member. So the first item has to do with the competing numbers that you saw for the roofing improvements. So this is where the conversation will kind of go back and forth and could get a little harder to follow. When we talk about unfunded projects in relation to the operating budget, we're talking about the unfunded need for fiscal year 24, strictly for 24. When we talk about items that we're introducing into the 5-year CIP, the capital improvement program, the numbers that we're bringing forward are the 5-year total. So the intent here was to introduce a re-roofing program because we know that our roofs are not in good condition, and it would be approximately a $500,000 project for each year over the next 5 years. And we would tackle our roofing deficiencies, kind of in reverse order. So that's why the numbers, I think that's why you might see a discrepancy in the numbers. Now, with regard to community center and or courtyard, we have evaluated all of the roofs at all of our sites, and it should probably be more appropriately called city facilities roofing, but the courtyard is part of that inventory. And I don't believe that we would propose doing that roof in year 1 of the 5-year. But I think if there is any real possibility that the courtyard is going to remain, that is a piece of work that we need to strongly consider. Because what we didn't get to talk about, during the whole discussion about asset management and whatnot, is that whether you're talking about roads and streets or playgrounds or our building facilities, the enemy of all of them is water intrusion. So if we think that we're going to be in this courtyard or any other facility for a long time, and we start neglecting things like roof replacement, we will open ourselves up to other improvements that will fall out of that as the water intrudes into the walls and kind of rots away the fascia and whatnot. So I think that we can certainly make a commitment that we will not move forward on a courtyard roofing project until we have a better outcome of what the study is. But the bottom line of this is to identify that the city does have a backlog of about $2.5 million in roofs that need to be replaced.
Okay, thank you. And I know we're going to talk much more about the courtyard on other occasions, but is it even conceivable that we could consider a piece of real estate outside the city limits relatively close because we're such a small city to actually for the future courtyard if something like that occurred?
I think I'll answer the question from a functional perspective. I do think that if you're outside the city limits and if you're, I mean, you certainly will have some efficiencies or the lack thereof depending on your location, right? So all of the other elements aside, the courtyard is fairly centrally located right now. And so that does have an effect on the amount of travel time that the employees have to do and, you know, things of that nature. Relocating a courtyard, whether it's at the edge of the city within or even on the other side of the city limit line could present some increases in travel time, which really is a loss of productivity if you look at it that way. So I think that when we do this evaluation, we're certainly going to be looking at locations that would hope to minimize that. But you know, at this point, I don't think anybody has a grand site in mind. I know we've talked about other sites as potential, but I think each site that gets evaluated would have to be looked at for what it does to what the effect would be on our maintenance and operations work.
Vice Mayor Landry?
Then why is the roof in City Hall not on here? The bathrooms are leaking and the city clerk's office leaks.
I will happily rename this item to be city facilities roofing. and it will include City Hall. And it may or may not include the courtyard. Let's see.
Great. Wait, let me just see here real quick. I'm going to just make a general comment. We color coded everything but the CIP. And I tried to go through and color code and relate what was green, what was purple. So just, it's a comment. I should have made it later. Would it be possible, because, well, let me step back a second. Why is the central green not it's on the unfunded list? When we're going to be, I mean, you and I have talked about the sidewalk lifting and heaving. So why is that in the unfunded list and not in the capital improvement?
That is a great question. And in answering that, let me also call your attention to the fact that on packet page 40 and 41, we have a whole variety of projects that are quote unquote unfunded at this point.
Right. That's the list I'm referencing.
Yes. So one of the dynamics that will no doubt play into how we move forward with Measure O, and you heard Nora talk about where we are with the actual approved capital projects that we're moving forward with, is that there is still some unallocated money in Measure O in the shared costs project. And we also know that we have some elements on this site that we would like to move forward with. And we have not budgeted any money toward Orchard City Green, the gravel lot improvements, or any of the sidewalk and intersection around here until we really see where we end up with the bids and the construction costs. And then at that point, that would be the appropriate time for us to take stock of the unallocated money and come back to council and talk about whether we should allocate that if we don't need it for any of the current bids, what we should allocate it for in the unfunded list. And it would kind of contain those elements that I just spoke of. Now, in the event that we do want to move forward with additional improvements beyond that, we would need to look at alternate funding sources. And I think Orchard City Green would probably be an appropriate use of the park fund if we were doing some improvements out here, but we have not proposed that yet, pending the results of where we end up with the two projects that are soon to go out to bid.
How can we spend Measure O money? It's not in the bond. Dan read the bond thing. I mean, I don't see how spending money on the green could come out of Measure O.
Well, I don't believe that the green, in my opinion, I don't believe that the green needs renovation. I thought that what we were talking about was whether the sidewalks needed replacement. And if there is a ingress egress issue that comes as a result of the Measure O projects, that would be an appropriate use of the Measure O funds, because we have also talked previously about parking improvements, sidewalk improvements, and driveway improvements, which, because they would be directly related to the Measure O improvements, I believe those would be eligible. We would certainly want to double check that before we propose a project. But what is not eligible are things like roofing improvements on City Hall. And I think that was the element that came up at the last discussion, where we could pretty much put that one to bed, that would not be an appropriate use of the Measure O funds.
Okay, I don't think we're gonna have money left over, but that's okay.
Have hope.
We're gonna have money left over. I think that's my questions at this point.
Councilmember Lopez? And I don't have any questions. So that concludes the staff presentations on the three items. I want to thank staff for all of the work that went into the presentation and a lot of information. I'll now open it up for public comment, and I'll ask if anyone in the chamber wishes to speak. And I don't see anyone online that's participating. So I will close the public comment and bring it back to council for discussion and direction to the staff. And they're looking for direction on the work plan, the operating budget, and the CIP. So if there are areas that you are a priority, we need to discuss that and then provide that direction to council, to staff. Councilmember Lopez?
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for the presentations and the work that went into them. This is a new approach from what I've seen before to the budget, and I think you brought us back exactly what I and I think others asked for, which is tell us what what the trade-offs are, the costs, and what's realistic and what's not. So thank you. I think that's going to let us have a really informed discussion while still working to reach some of the new areas and new objectives we're trying. I think I'll start broadly. I think in general, laying it out as tiers 1, 2, and 3 is very helpful. And I agree in general with the assessment, and I'm happy to go more into specifics if we need to, but I'll start broad, which is that generally speaking, I think the tier 3, which generally looks more into future needs, I think it's important, and we don't want to lose those or delete those somewhere, but they're not necessarily priorities for me for the next fiscal year. Doesn't mean they're not priorities, but I agree. Let's work on the areas that we need to now. Now there's a few other. There's a couple of things where that I distinguish from that, such as the Hamilton area plan, where ultimately the payoff is going to be years in the future. But I do see that as something we need to be working now, because if we start later, it'll be too late to get that done in time. But with the way that this is laid out into the different tiers, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I'm okay generally with what's there. There's a couple of things that I want to raise and see if there's interest in doing. Actually, before I get to that, just one other thing. I do want to state for the record that I think the climate action plan, I'm glad we're applying for the grant. Maybe there will be more potential sources of funding that I would be interested in having us look into. But I do think that is one that, regardless of whether or not we get the funds, we've made the commitment, and we should be willing to cover the full cost if we need to as a city. Just because of the request from the community, because of the agreement, and not that it's binding, but I do think it carries some weight. I think there's also strong feelings on previous councils about that and the sustainability goal. So I think that's one where there's a lot of alignment, and I don't want to see us lose momentum. Although, of course, I hope that we do get the grant funding and maybe others. Now, I want to surface a couple of other ideas. One thing, which may also not necessarily be a current year thing, but which I'd like us to start doing some thinking about and having conversations. and Todd, this will be for your department, is a conversation about signal priority for our public transit. And I've raised this question with VTA staff, and I'm not sure. I know they're interested in having some of those conversations and working with cities. And they've now had some experience with Sunnyvale, where I think some more lessons learned that when they're previously mostly working with San Jose, probably not necessarily as applicable to Campbell. So I'd be interested in picking that up. I understand. I know we've had some conversations. I don't know the full extent of that, but I'd be interested in just try to figure out a little bit more what that would take. That's probably not a current fiscal year thing, but I want to start thinking about it and seeing what that would look like in future years, if appropriate, and if there's more interest in that. I also do want to raise, I think that this is an appropriate juncture with the ARPA funding and where we are. I'd like to see us do something a little bit bold and ambitious. And I know there's been general comments that, what are ways that we can have this funding really serve the community in a very direct way. And I think also in line with the new priority for I think we end up calling the category community health, and including a couple of things under that, but that general category. I wonder if there's a chunk of that ARPA funding that we could put towards homelessness prevention programs, or some kind of direct assistance, and that could take many different shapes. I don't know that now is the time to dictate what that would take. I'm open-minded on that, but some form of direct assistance to the community that will have a real direct and immediate impact. I'm open on the amounts and what that ultimately looks like, and again, that may not necessarily be a current year fiscal item, but I think it's very much in keeping with the programs that are coming out of the housing element process and the general plan process. And with a lot of interest. So I would be interested in having more of a conversation about that, but really starting to reserve the use of that ARPA funding now and making some of those decisions. So I'll close there. Thanks again for the presentation. I look forward to hearing other comments.
Councilmember Furtado.
Just following up on your last comment, I agree with you that I think it'd be very good to have a discussion about homelessness, and I would like to see that, as you mentioned, addressed in a more tangible way and for funding and so on. Perhaps we could even consider in the future sort of a joint meeting with representatives from San Jose and Los Gatos in particular. They're our closest cities, or any others, because homeless individuals can go back and forth, and perhaps some regional approaches might help. I don't know, just a suggestion, but I understand what you're saying.
And perhaps the county.
Yes, exactly. Yes, the county is very interested in that too. So I'm going to make my comments with respect to two subdivisions. First of all, with respect to one-time expenditures, not for personnel, but just expenditures, just make some general comments. If we have to cut back or postpone, I would be in favor of moving ahead with those items that have to do with building stability, HVAC replacements, things along those lines, and if necessary, postpone some of the other elements like carpet replacements, things of that nature. Sometime in the future, I would like us, and we did not discuss this before, I don't think, as a council, but sometime in the future, I would like us to consider the idea of, frankly, replacing the seats where the audience sits in this chamber. Those of you in those seats probably find them among the most uncomfortable. I've been a visitor here myself, and that's certainly my comment over the years. I don't know if any of you have seen the City Hall of Cupertino, but they have all movable seats. And if we took everything out and just had chairs, people could arrange them as they needed. We could sort of have this room for other multi-purpose uses, but that's just not officially on the agenda, but something in the future, perhaps. So that would be my comment, first of all, just about buildings and adding elements or changing or anything along those lines. My other comments now, at the request of city staff, to take a look at proposed permanent staffing positions, tiers 1, 2, and 3. If I'm reading this correctly, most of the elements in tier 1 are reclassifications. So I'm assuming that I'm interpreting this correctly, that as one position goes away and gets reclassified to a higher position, we just add one salary and subtract the other. So the difference is really fairly small. So I think those are needed and pretty minor. With respect to tier 2, I think I did already ask my question previously about the purchasing agent and the buyer. And with respect to tier 3, my comments are as following. Under finance, find it here. There was an admin analyst listed somewhere. I can't seem to find it right now. I guess it was it an admin? Yes, it was an admin analyst under finance. I'm not quite sure whether we really need that or not. I have some questions about the need for it for this fiscal year. If we have to, I'm talking about if we have to cut back, and it sounds like we do. So those are my recommendations. So the admin analyst in finance occurs to me. Other positions that occur to me include the request to add 2 additional police officers. I just feel, and the explanation for both of those is to meet anticipated needs in the future as the population increases. Yes, the population will increase, but I don't think it's going to increase that quickly, that fast. So I would think that my recommendation would be not to fund those for this fiscal year, but consider it for another fiscal year, again, if we have to cut back. And I think my other comment was already addressed with respect to the recreation supervisor. I wasn't sure how that was going to be part-time, full-time, and so on. So now I already asked that question. So those are my priorities, just in terms of should we need to cut back and not be able to fund all the positions this year. And I know that as time occurs, and again, many of the funding elements that we discussed previously are dependent, hopefully, upon grants. You know, depending upon whether we do or we don't get the grants, I'm assuming that these various items will be brought back to us for further discussion. Or if our finances improve or don't improve, again, coming back to the council and sort of talking about this and being a part of this whole process. And I know previously we collectively, if I'm interpreting our intention from before, had indicated we did want to be kept in the loop for various aspects of Measure O, the details, so that we can weigh in and talk about that and have feel more comfortable in the conversation when we are asked by other people about Measure O and some of its expenditures. So those are my comments. Thank you.
And I'll go back to Councilmember Lopez.
Thank you. Yeah, just a brief addition that I meant to add to my comments. So, you know, I said what I did about tier 3, but I would add that while of course budget time is the most appropriate time to consider and we want to holistically look at new positions, I would say that if we end up not funding a position, but the circumstances change and suddenly there's an acute need for that, I would ask that staff be communicative and transparent with council, and if there's a need to do an adjustment mid-year at another point, at least let's have that conversation, just so that we're not hamstring ourselves if things change.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Landry.
You know, I forgot to ask this question on page 34 of the packet. under the 2024 funded projects, the library is listed at 24 million, but PD is not. It says library renovation, police FF&E and shared costs, but there's $25 million not shown in that total. Is that just a typo or on page 34?
I'm gonna just try to navigate to the page you're on right now.
It's the 2024 funded projects. It shows carryover and then 24 budget, and library has one, PD has one, and shared costs, but the PD building is not on that list.
Oh, okay. I'm there now. So this page specifically shows projects that will receive appropriation in fiscal year 24 and the amount that will be carried over for that project as well. In the case of your question, for the PD portion of that project, there are no additional appropriations in fiscal year 24, and that's the reason why it's not listed on this particular table.
Okay, that doesn't make, I mean, I get what you're saying, but if you're going to show carryover, didn't PD get extra money too? Didn't they get grants? It's confusing to not show it on this list.
Yes, I believe PD did receive additional grants, and that was taken to council during fiscal year 23.
Okay.
And that's why it's not part of the schedule specifically.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go back to where I started when I was in the wrong category. I think that when the traffic calming study occurs, hopefully we will change the criteria so more projects will qualify. And I made this comment last year of the 100,000 versus the 50, because Todd, you had said each one somewhere around 20, 25,000. And so it's whether you do 1 or 2 or 4 or 5. So I think that by updating the policy, I think we're going to end up needing more money in there. The senior engineering technician, I think if I remember right, the description is also as an architect or landscape architect. It's not just an engineer. Because a lot of these projects, building, assessments, parks, all of those could be outside of just an engineering position. And I've always, I mean, not just because I'm a landscape architect, but I always have thought we needed a landscape architect and definitely an architect. So that title description, I think, includes that. If it doesn't, I would like that to come forward. And then you also mentioned another description of somebody you were changing. I'm assuming all descriptions of positions come back to council, right?
Correct. If there's a change in job spec, they would come back to
in the job description. Okay, so I would like to see the 0.75 engineer position go to 1.0. And I would like to see, so my concern is we're going to build these, and I think you mentioned we're going to build these beautiful, new, wonderful buildings, and the rest of City Hall is going to look bad. We're going to kill the lawn, the green, there's sidewalk issues that relate to Measure O, and I don't want to see Measure O graded and landscaped, and then a month or two later, we tear it out and fix the sidewalk. So I really would like to see, if it's not funded as a capital project, at least money for the study, and whether we add it on to Measure O architect teams to get them to, I mean, especially the sidewalk on the library is my biggest one with, the sidewalk goes up like this. But I think if we do these, we should have a budget of study money. What happens when we take the lawn out? What happens, there's paint chipping on the building, roofs leaking. So I would like to see Civic Center have improvements, and that I know that would not come out of Measure O, or probably won't, but I would like to see that in there. And then, so regarding the ARPA money, yes, I would like to see us address more issues regarding homelessness. I don't know what that entails, but I would like to see some money set aside for that. And I would agree with Dan about, don't necessarily replace carpet right now and work on roofs and more structural integrity, things that leak or the transformers and that kind of stuff. Regarding the police officers, I know it takes a really long time to get someone on board. They're all shaking their heads over there. But is that, if it takes a year to get one on board, does it fall within the fiscal year of 24, 23, 24, or does it fall into the next year? So if we need them, it's just going to take a long time, and you have 150 for outreach and getting the person, bringing them in. So I would support keeping that as long as it means the budget is going to occur in 23, 24. The seats in here, Dan, you weren't here when we cleaned them. Apparently each row filled up the bucket of water with how dirty it was. So getting them clean was a big deal. I've been wanting to try to get rid of the seats for the whole time I've been here and put in movable chairs because it would be more functional as a space. So I'm on board with that. But it goes back to my comment of, do we spend money on carpet or do we spend money on roof repair? And to me, I'd rather see a civic center master plan than pay for seats to be replaced. But I really like this format with the colors. It makes it, especially I'm a colored person, it makes it easy to track. I would just go back to all these projects because then it really shows, especially for the public, well, you have all these great strategic plan ideas, but all these work elements don't fall in there. They're all operational or whatever. So like I went through and I highlighted purple where all the ADA, accessibility, traffic calming, Virginia Park, that's all under the community. Streets, I'm not sure where that actually falls in the colors, but it would help. And my last comment is I don't think we can change the money where street maintenance falls in. Isn't there set aside money we can only spend on street maintenance, or can we transfer money like I'm trying to focus back on the Civic Center?
Street maintenance money is largely for a specific purpose, but it's not just one source. It comes from a variety of sources, including SB1. We have some coming from Measure B through VTA. We have some coming as vehicle impact fees through the garbage contract. So there's a whole host of a collection of money that comes in for annual street maintenance, but the bottom line is you really can't spend it anywhere else.
It's like the construction and conveyance for parks. We can't spend that on other things.
Correct.
So I see a lot of projects in here for streets, sidewalks, and I would really like us to focus, like the Civic Center should be getting upgraded and focus on this as a bigger project. And I understand pavement cycles and all that, but it just seems like, when we get done in 2 years, we want the whole thing to look wonderful. We want everybody to say, wow, you really thought this out and get all those improvements. I think the climate action plan should be a higher priority. I think it's still on the unfunded list. And the cannabis ordinance, I don't know if we put any money in for just the partial studies or increased bills, the legal money a little to see what it would take to do an early assessment to say this is what it would take to have a full program. Let's see, I think that's it here. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and, I've got comments all over the place. I'm going to try and go by the attachments, and I'll start with D. And generally, I'm okay with the recommendations that are on there. With the proposed new or increased general fund expenditures, again, I'm for the most part okay. I would look to when we're proposing and adding staff to really think about using either contractual services for some of the issues or some of the positions and or temporary staffing as opposed to permanent staffing. Let's see, like for instance, the building maintenance. Let me get to the next attachment. There's too many attachments here to, and then the other one is on the significant recruitment efforts. I really do support that, but if $150,000 seems like a lot, so I'd like to understand a little bit better about what that money goes towards as far as the recruitment. I know we increased it this year, and it seems like we're increasing it again to 150. So I'd like a little bit more understanding of that. And then as far as the new positions in the permanent staffing, again, I think we need to, I realize that we have a lot of needs today and in the future. And so I appreciate trying to quantify it in the different tiers. I'm okay with the small requests such as, the report refers to it as reclassing a position, but I see converting a part-time or a third-time position to full-time is more of a conversion and not really a reclass of a position. So I would support the museum position being restored to full-time, as well as the executive assistant in finance, and reclassifying the assistant finance director. We obviously have a vacancy, and so now's the time to evaluate that and reclassify that if the position is warranted. As far as general reclassifications, I don't necessarily support those if they're recommended until there's sufficient data to explain what the current position is doing and how it's exceeding the need to be reclassed, and how those duties that incumbent is performing, how that's going to be absorbed by the existing staff and or the person who's being reclassed. So I don't necessarily support that. As far as the housing manager, I do recommend that we move forward with that. Obviously, it is an important need. Again, I would look to a limited term position to begin with that process, so that we can evaluate how that position fits into the organization and what the job descriptions are going to do and address needs. I'd like to see some of the ARPA funds being applied to the trust fund for housing, so that we have, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have as a city, is that we don't have money in a pot to help with our homeless and our transitional housing. And so I would look to see if we could use some ARPA funds to augment that process and provide some much needed homeless services that are evident in our city. I support the clinician mental health. Again, I think if we could look to using ARPA funds to fund that would be something that I would support. As far as the emergency services coordinator, I understand the need for that. I think that we, again, could look to contracting and or partnering with county fire to augment those services. So I would ask that we explore those options. I think that's the majority on those issues. On the CIP, I generally concur with the CIP, although I do have a concern about the roofing on the corporation yard because of the pending questions that are looming about relocating that. So I'm okay with adding it, but with the caveat that we really defer any major re-roofing of it until we're really sure that until all those questions are answered about relocating the corporation yard. And I am somewhat skeptical about that because of there's well, for many reasons. I'm not going to go into that now. Let's see, the climate action plan, again, I support that. And again, if we could use grant funding and possibly funding that by a contract position. That would be more appropriate in my opinion. Let's see. I appreciate the crossing guards and the work that's being done for the joint MOU on that with the school district. And then on the CIP, again, a couple things that have come up today regarding the programming of those. And obviously, Councilmember Furtado talked about possibly reconverting the council chamber seats. To me, that should be a project that should be considered possibly in a future CIP. It's not only an ADA issue, in my view, but it also is a functionality issue and would provide additional space needed for the ability to have a study session or having our budget workshops here instead of having to go to the community center. I do think that the sidewalks in Orchard City Green need some attention. There's a lot of uneven pavement out there, and to me, it's a bit of a trip hazard. So I know that I don't want to mix it in with the Measure O, but I do see that there is a need out there. And then finally, a couple of priorities that I feel are important that haven't really been talked about today is that we have these future needs. Obviously, expenses are going up, and we need a way to fund some of this. And so we really need, I feel that the council needs to look at revenue enhancements. And if we're not going to look at revenue enhancements, then we need to look at reducing expenditures. And I don't think that's going to happen because expenditures are going up every year. A lot of it's out of our control. So I think that should be a priority. I also think that we need to have a plan to replenish our reserves. Our council policy says that when we use reserves, we need to have a plan to restore those within a 5-year period. And so I think that needs to be considered as part of the budget process. And then again, as far as the ARPA funding, we do have a chunk of money out there. Anything that we can do to support our community, our homeless, and our housing efforts, I think should be a priority. So those are my comments. And I don't know if there are additional comments. Vice Mayor Landry?
I forgot about the revenue in trying to find more revenue. We have talked about different levels of impact fees and also like the short-term rental policy, trying to get TOT. And so we don't have that anywhere in the work plan, is to look at, we talked about traffic impact, there's some levels of development fees. So yeah, I would support adding to the work plan, looking at ways to generate revenue.
Councilmember Furtado?
Just briefly, I wanted to just comment on a couple of your comments, Mayor. I agree with you. I had a question also about spending $150K on recruitment. I have some questions about that. And I also agree with you on enhancing and replenishing reserve funds on the schedule that you mentioned as well. Thank you.
Any additional comments, Councilmember Lopez? So I know that we all provided individual comments. Is that enough for staff to move forward with, or would you like further direction?
No, I appreciate the dialogue, and I appreciate really the council keeping it at a high strategic level. And I think as was our goals to get the feedback that you gave us today will allow us to do the number crunching and apply the theories and the strategies that we just talked about and there was consensus on, and come forward with a balanced budget for you in May. And then we'll try to certainly highlight these things for you, and any questions that you had today that we didn't answer, we'll certainly follow up with those questions at your next meeting as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again to staff. Appreciate all the work. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting.
7 minutes.